Thank you all for joining us. My name is Aaron Lefland. I'm the executive director of the new Canaan Land Trust, which is home to the Land Trust's Firefly Sanctuary on Sleepy Hollow Road. And I am so thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Sara Lewis of Tufts University. Sara is an internationally renowned firefly expert and is here to answer questions about fireflies at our preserves and around the world more broadly. So to get us started, Dr. Lewis, would you mind telling us about sort of how you came to study fireflies and maybe a little bit of your background and why you pursued this animal?
Certainly. Aaron, first, I want to thank you for having me. I'm really, really delighted to be here. And who wouldn't want to study fireflies? If you're an ecologist, particularly if you're interested in sort of behavior and evolutionary biology, fireflies are like the perfect organism to study. But I have to say, it was kind of accidental that I ended up spending a lot of my life with fireflies. I was a graduate student in North Carolina, and I was actually doing my PhD on tropical marine ecology. But one summer, I happened to be waiting for some grant funding to come through, and I was hanging around in my backyard, and I was sitting there with my dog, and a thunderstorm was coming through, and it was kind of getting dark and darker and darker, late afternoon. And just before it started to rain, I noticed that all around me, these silent sparks were coming up out of the grass and surrounding us. And I grew up in Connecticut, so you would think I would have seen fireflies before, but I actually had no memory of fireflies from my childhood. Spent a lot of time outside, but no memory of fireflies. And I was just amazed. I mean, just gobsmacked. It was incredible. It was beautiful. And there is my scientific mind, just going and going and going. And I'm thinking to myself, what the heck is going on here? What are all of these creatures doing, making these silent flashes of light? And so that was my introduction to fireflies. I spent the next day in the library. In between my marine studies, I started going out just into my backyard and learning everything I could about fireflies and talking to firefly experts and trying to figure out, what we knew and what we didn't know about fireflies. It turned out there was a lot we didn't know. And so my students and I at Tufts University actually have spent a couple of decades actually looking at the intimate details of firefly courtship and sex lives. And wow, what a lucky thing to be able to pursue this work. It's been really, really exciting. We've made lots of cool discoveries. And so I just feel very fortunate to be able to have spent a career working on such wonder-inspiring creatures.
That's an incredible story. I think everybody feels that sense of awe and inspiration when they maybe have that first experience seeing hundreds or thousands of fireflies. I mean, even the one individual can inspire that awe and wonder. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you're doing now with fireflies and maybe what you're hoping to learn in the coming years, or as you finish your academic career, maybe what a dream goal would be to have an understanding of?
Yeah. So it's been, I have no regrets. As a scientist, scientists are trained to really drill down to the fine details of various of the natural world. And so I, as I said, we learned a lot about firefly courtship. What it is that females are looking for in a male firefly and why they might be choosy about which males they mate with. It turns out we discovered completely serendipitously, we discovered that during mating, male fireflies are actually not just transferring gametes, but they're actually transferring what's called, technical term here, nuptial gift. That's really what it's called. They're transferring a package to females that has sperm, and a whole bunch of other things. And it's a really big deal for females because males that give bigger nuptial gifts actually are able to lay more eggs and then contribute more offspring to the next generation. So yeah, I wrote a popular book about fireflies. It's called Silent Sparks, The Wondrous World of Fireflies. And I tell the story of some of these scientific discoveries and the excitement, the thrill of it in the book. And yeah, it's cool. So that has been a lot of fun and I think very useful. However, over the years, I've also traveled a lot around the world studying fireflies. And as I've done that, I meet people, actually mostly on airplanes, in airports, neighbors, friends. And over the years, I heard the same question again and again and again. And what people were saying to me is, wow, you study fireflies. That's cool. Hey, why don't I see as many fireflies around as there were when I was growing up? There just don't seem to be as many fireflies anymore. And so, I give my usual scientific thing, well, do you spend as much time outside? Are you mostly watching TV in the evening? Do you live in a city? Did you grow up in the country? All of those things. It turns out that firefly experts notice the same thing. So over the past, few decades even, in many parts of the world, it seems like firefly populations are declining. And so in the past few years, I and my students have turned most of our attention now to firefly conservation and trying to figure out which fireflies, there's lots of different species of firefly, which fireflies are most at risk. What are the biggest threats to fireflies in the US and also around the world? And can we identify the ones that are most threatened? And then can we take some action to try to preserve the threatened species? So one of the things that we've been doing during this pandemic year, turned out, one of the silver linings is that we've had time to work together with the Xerces Society, and we've actually just finished assessing all of the U.S. firefly species. We've just finished assessing about 140 of the U.S. firefly species. There's probably around 200 species in the U.S. And we assess them according to the sort of gold standard of conservation biology, which is the red list, which is a group of standards published by the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And lots and lots of species that are threatened with extinction appear on the red list, and lots of species that are doing fine also appear on the red list. So it's a ranking of extinction risk. And so it was very exciting this past year to be able to apply these standard criteria to firefly species in the U.S. We're planning to do this with firefly species globally, and the U.S. it's the first group of species that we've looked at. So that just got published in March, and so all of that information is freely available on the IUCN Red List. You just search for Firefly and come up with pages of Firefly information. So that was a lot of work, and we were very, very gratified to find out that about a third of the species of firefly in the U.S. are doing just fine. That's really, really good news. There's lots of fireflies that are doing quite well. There's another set of species, about half of the fireflies in the U.S., where we really don't have enough data yet on them to be able to tell whether their populations are declining, stable, increasing. We need more information. And I guess this is exciting, but it's also kind of scary. We identified 18 species of firefly that in the US that are at risk of extinction, ranging from really, really at risk of extinction, critically endangered, to vulnerable to extinction. And so we are now working with state officials and other agencies to try to come up with plans to protect those fireflies, those 18 species of firefly.
Excellent. Well, I mean, that's sort of a great segue into sort of all of the different things that I'd hoped to talk about with you during this conversation, ranging from sort of how fireflies behave and mate and reproduce to where they live and what measures we can take to protect them. So maybe we can take a step back and give our listeners sort of a general overview of the life cycle of the fireflies, some basic information about when they are bioluminescent, what phase in their life cycle we're seeing them, and sort of what we think about as the firefly is really just one part of its life.
Yeah, that's right. So, I bet that most of our listeners today probably think of fireflies as those kind of ethereal adults that are flying around, lighting up the night sky in the summertime. And every once in a while, I see on Twitter or somewhere else, somebody posts a question, what happens to fireflies in the winter? Where do they go? And so it's an amazing thing, but, fireflies are beetles. And just like other beetles, they have a life cycle where they undergo what we call complete metamorphosis. So just like a butterfly, they go through various life stages. They start with an egg, like we all do. And that egg hatches out into a stage that's called a larva. And it's a baby firefly. And firefly larvae, the eggs hatch out into larvae. Those larvae crawl down into the ground, and they spend up to 2 years living underground in that larval stage. Baby fireflies are actually, I think they're cute, but they're very, very voracious predators. They eat all kinds of things that live in the soil, including some species are specialist feeders on earthworms. Other species are more generalist kind of feeders. They'll eat like anything they can sink their jaws into. And they're foraging either in the leaf litter or underground. And they spend, depending on the latitude, but in New England, they'll spend 2 winters in that juvenile stage. And it's not until their second spring that they will be big enough then to undergo one more metamorphosis, a transformation into a pupa, which also lives underground or in rotting wood, depending on the species. And then in the late spring, the early summer, they will finally crawl out of the ground and they will look like a normal looking firefly. And the adult stage, the surprising thing is that after all of that time, let's say 1 or 2 years, depending on the latitude of living underground, the adult stage only lives for about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks or a month, depending on the species again. But most adult fireflies don't feed at all. And so they're spending down their capital that they have gained as a larva, all that energy and all that body mass and all of the stored reserves are being used up as the adult fireflies are flying around, flashing, walking around, trying to find a mate, mating, going out the next night, same thing. They'll only live a couple of weeks as an adult. So fireflies have the fireflies that we think of, those ethereal sparks in the dark, they have a really, really long and interesting backstory. And they have spent that all of their juvenile years in sometimes a completely different habitat. So it's really interesting. And then, they're out there in the summertime. We think of fireflies mean summertime, but they don't. They really, they have a long backstory. And if we want to protect fireflies, we kind of need to think about them in all of their different manifestations.
Yeah, that's really important to consider, is that we're really only seeing a fraction of their life cycle, and where the sort of grandeur that we're witnessing is only possible through years and years of maturation and growth and preparation for the couple of weeks that we like to enjoy. So in that adult form, when they're flashing and that's their mating period, can you tell us a little bit about the sort of mating rituals that fireflies use, maybe the ones specific to this area of the world in New England, and how that translates into what visitors to our sanctuary are seeing during the summer?
Sure. Yeah. So, there's a few different kinds of fireflies. The ones that we have here in New England that are most obvious are the lightning bug fireflies. And these are fireflies where the adults have evolved a sexual communication signal that's based on their ability to produce quick, bright flashes, very precisely timed flashes of light. And they use that as a way of communicating with one another. One group of fireflies in New England, which are called the Fraternist fireflies, are pretty famous for having a back and forth flash dialogue where the males will fly around in a particular habitat, and they will patrol, giving a very, very specific advertising flash. They're saying to anyone who's willing to listen to them, including us, we can eavesdrop on these courtship signals. They're saying, I'm a male, I'm a Fraternist pyralis, I'm a Big Dipper male, and I'm here looking for a female. And they will repeat that signal, which is very precisely timed bursts of light given at a particular interval of time between those light bursts. And they repeat that for as long as they're flying on a given evening. The females, meanwhile, are usually not flying, although they can fly. They're often sitting on perches down in the vegetation, and they're surveying the skies. They're looking up. They're trying to see male signals that are the right one for them, their own species. And when they see a male flashing in a particular pattern that looks attractive, they respond with a flash of their own. So females will curl, they're down on the ground, and they're generally not flashing unless they're responding to a male. And when they see a male they like, they'll curl their abdomen towards that male flash, and then they'll give usually just a single, slightly longer flash back to the male. That says to him, hey, I'm a female, I'm interested. So then they strike up a dialogue. They're talking back and forth. It's kind of like firefly sexting, right? So he comes closer. He flashes his flash pattern again. She looks at him again. She might respond. She might not respond. Females are pretty picky. If she responds again, he'll come closer and closer. They strike up a conversation. Eventually, that male who's been flying around like all over the habitat trying to find these darn females, he'll finally land near the female, but it might be, up to, I don't know, like a foot away from the female. The female's on a perch in the grass. He's like a foot away. You can imagine that then it takes a long time, sometimes hours, for that male who's often going to walk to the female. He climbs up a grass blade, down a grass blade. Whoops, wrong one. They have this like flash dialogue again. Ooh, I'm on the wrong thing. I'm going to go over here. And then up the grass blade, down the grass blade. Finally, he'll find the female. They'll make contact. And then they'll mate. It's it's kind of a grueling process to watch the whole thing, because you're just like rooting for the male. You want to kind of cross the pieces of grass so that he can get to find her faster, but we never do that. So that's the flash dialogue that goes on, and it's one of the great things about Fireflies is all of this, well, most of it, we think, is happening in this channel, this visual channel of communication, right? So we can eavesdrop on their courtship signals. It's so great. You can actually record them. You can very precisely measure those that flash dialogue for different species, and people have done that. Scientists have done that, and that's how we know what the species-specific courtship dialogues look like for different species. They're also temperature dependent. So depending on the temperature, they change a little bit. The timing changes a little bit. The other cool thing about the visual signal, it's a channel that people, that we can see. And so we can also simulate those signals, play them back to female fireflies, and see exactly what kind of male signal the female likes. And so it's really easy to line up a bunch of female fireflies, play them different signals that are computer generated, and then ask them, what do they like? They respond with a flash if they like something. So they're voting with their lights.
It's incredible. You're starting a conversation with another species. One question, sort of going back to something you mentioned earlier, you had said that the type of fireflies we have around here are lightning bugs, and I had always thought that those were sort of synonymous, a firefly and a lightning bug. Is there a distinction, and if so, is that what is it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So common names are funny, and all lightning bugs in some part of the country, people call them lightning bugs. Other parts of the country, same insects are called fireflies. And so all of these fireflies for lightning bugs, they're not flies and they're not bugs. So both of these names are kind of misleading. But all the firefly beetles belong to one family. It's called the Lampyridae. And there are different kinds of beetles that are in that family. They're unified because they all can trace their ancestry back to a single common ancestor that lived about 150 million years ago. They also are unified because every single member of this family has a juvenile form, a larva that lights up, but not all the adults light up. So when fireflies first evolved, we think that the very first firefly had a larva that lit up as a warning signal, and an adult form that looked like a regular beetle and didn't light up at all. They didn't use light as a way of finding mates. Instead, they used chemical signals or pheromones to find their mates. And so we still have a big group of fireflies, many, many different species in the United States. They're called fireflies, but the adults don't light up at all. And so those are sometimes called daytime dark fireflies because they don't light up dark, and they fly during the daytime instead of at night. And you can see them flying around actually there's some that are flying around in early spring, like March and April. There's some daytime dark fireflies that are flying in New England right now. I saw one this morning. And then there's different species that come out in the summer that are also really, really common, flying during the daytime. They look just like fireflies, but the adults don't light up. The juveniles do. And then there's also glowworm fireflies. We don't have any of those in New England, but there are many species in the United States where the females light up. Adult females light up, but the males don't. Sometimes the males do, but the females are flightless and they glow instead of flashing. And then, so the lightning bug fireflies, that combination of those two words refers to the subset of beetles in this family that use quick, bright flashes. They're the typical fireflies, but you need to remember that there's other firefly species that are never going to look like that when they're flying around.
Okay. Well, yeah. Thanks for clarifying. I had no idea, and I think it's incredible that this evolutionary pattern has happened where some of them use the glows at certain times of their life, and some use it for mating, some don't. And an incredible sort of display of biodiversity within one family of beetles. Going back to the mating behaviors, we've heard about this thing called the femme fatale. Is that something you may be able to explain a little bit, and that phenomenon with the species that we have in New Canaan?
Yeah, so I am imagining myself out in a field, the firefly field, right now, and you're probably seeing lots and lots of different flash patterns and things that are zigzagging through the night. Some are flying really high, some are flying fast and flashing only occasionally. Some of them are flying really low to the ground, and they're flashing maybe a double pulse flash, or maybe even 3 quick flashes in a row and then stop, and then 3 quick flashes again. So all of these different flash patterns are typical for different species. And so in here in New England, we have 3 different groups of lightning bug fireflies. The ones that are flying low to the ground are usually members of the group of the group of fireflies called Fraternist fireflies. There's about several, there's in New England, there's about a dozen different species of Fraternist that you might be seeing. And then there's another group of fireflies called Pyractomina, and they could be flying. They're typically found in wetlands or wetter areas, but they might be in the field too. And then there's a third group of fireflies, and they are called Fraternist fireflies. They usually fly later in the evening, so when it's completely dark, and they are fast flyers, and they usually fly pretty high up. And so they typically have a slightly greener flash, whereas Fraternist have a yellower flash. So Fraternist fireflies are interesting, and one of the ways, the names are kind of confusing. Fraternist fireflies tend to be bigger, and they have longer legs relative to their body size, and they're really, really agile. They're very, very fast. If one lands on you, or if you see one walking on the ground, it's often flashing a lot and walking really, really fast. They look agitated. One of the ways that a mnemonic that I use to distinguish between Fraternist and Fraternist is Fraternist are little tiny fireflies. They're very calm when you catch them, and they're super cute. And Fraternist are kind of fierce. And people often, say about Fraternist that if Fraternist were the size of house cats, people might be afraid to go out at night. And the reason for this is that many Fraternist species have evolved this behavior where they are predators. They only target males of other firefly species. And so these Fraternist predators might also be flying around right now in the field. And they are, they fly around, they're pretty fast. The females fly, the males fly. They have a lot of different flash patterns that they can give in different contexts. And so in many cases, it's hard to identify the exact Fraternist species. They're taxonomically quite challenging, as we say in the business. But these Fraternist females have evolved a really amazing behavior where they will stop flying, hang out on the vegetation down where the Fraternist are flying, and they eavesdrop on the courtship dialogue that's going on between the male and the female of a Fraternist species. And so they have really big eyes, they're looking around, and they're watching this courtship dialogue, and they appear to be able to learn the female flash signals of different Fraternist species. So a female, they're called femme fatale, as you mentioned, because they're out there in the field. They are not looking for love. They're looking for dinner. So they will they'll watch a courtship dialogue, and then they will mimic the courtship signal that's normally given by the female of their intended prey. And it's just a light in the dark. What does the male know? He's really eager to mate. He's looking for a female of his own species, and he sees this flash. It looks just like a female of his own species. He flies closer. He flashes again. The predator female mimics that response. And if she's really, really good at this, it's called aggressive mimicry, she can lure him close enough that she can reach out. Fraturists also have really, really long legs, I mentioned. She can reach out her long legs, grab the male, and then that's dinner for her. Once a male Fraternist is caught by a Fraternist female, it's a very, very gory scene. There's some videos of it on the internet if you really want to get into it. But they're basically like Firefly vampires, these femme fatale. They bite into the shoulder of the male, and they're trying to, they kind of drink the blood. Firefly blood is white. And they sort of suck up the blood, and then they start just like chewing up all the soft parts of the male. It's incredibly gory, but fascinating, right? What are they doing? And why is this one particular group of fireflies, these femme fatale futurists, why have they evolved to be predators during their adult stage, whereas every other firefly doesn't really eat once they become adults? This is a question that was bugging fireflies for a really, really long time, until one brilliant Cornell entomologist, his name was Thomas Eisner. He was a chemical ecologist, and he discovered the reason for this weird behavior. It turns out that over evolutionary time, for reasons we don't know, this one particular group of fireflies somehow lost the ability to manufacture the fireflies taste bad. Most fireflies taste bad. They have chemical defenses inside their bodies circulating in their blood. And these are repellent to most things that eat insects. For example, birds, small mammals will not touch fireflies because they taste really bad and they're toxic. So what Tom Eisner discovered is that, in contrast to most firefly adults, Fraternist adults, and also the larvae, Fraternist adults somehow aren't toxic. They lost the metabolic machinery that they need to make their own protective toxins that would protect them against their own predators, like birds, like other insect-eating organisms. So instead, they've resorted to attacking other fireflies, and they're eating the other fireflies not because they need energy, but because they need those toxins. And so they're sequestering the toxins from other fireflies into their own bodies, circulating them in their own blood, and then using those, they're hijacking those toxins to use for their own protection. And these females actually are able to then put some of the toxins into their eggs, which protects the Fraternist femme fatale's eggs from things that normally would be eating insect eggs that are out there. Ooh, it's a gory story. And it's like, a firefly vampire brought to you by natural selection. It's crazy, right?
Yeah, you couldn't make that up if if you wanted to. It's yeah, I mean, yeah, just one of the other ways that fireflies have these amazing backstories that we're privileged to be able to learn about. Um, Maybe shifting a bit from mating to one of the maybe more fundamental questions that folks have just about the bioluminescence and the light that these insects produce, or these beetles produce. Can you explain, without getting too much into the chemistry, the science behind bioluminescence and what enables fireflies to create these iconic flashes?
Yeah, it's really a crazy thing, right? The ability is so magical. The ability to actually make light within your body and shine it out into the world to turn chemistry into light, a form of that transformation of energy. It's kind of miraculous. Most things that are bioluminescent actually live in the ocean. So bioluminescence is really, really common in the ocean. It evolved in the ocean, and most of the creatures, marine creatures, use bioluminescence not for mating, but actually as a defense. Right? It's kind of a warning signal. And fireflies. So bioluminescence is much less common on land. Fireflies are one of the biggest groups of bioluminescent land organisms. There's a couple other kinds of beetles that also light up, and there's some earthworms that light up. There's some fungi that light up. There's a couple of like the glowworms of New Zealand and Australia are a kind of fly, a larval fly that light up. But fireflies are yeah, they're my favorite bioluminescent organism. And
I wouldn't have guessed.
it is just a really incredible thing. And so it turns out that we think by reconstructing their evolutionary history, we think that the very first firefly ancestor, let's call it, lit up, as I mentioned, only in the juvenile stage. So larval fireflies invented this way of making light, and they did it as a warning. So firefly larvae have these toxins in their body, and they're crawling around in the ground. And so if they are in the dark, in a dark place, it doesn't really help to be brightly colored, like a monarch butterfly, right? Or a poisonous snake. You're not going to use yellow and black and orange because nobody will see those colors. Those are reflected light colors. Instead, fireflies invented the ability to make their own really, really bright thing, which turned out to be a luminescent, a light-based signal, a warning that says, I'm toxic, stay away. And so the way that they did this is they turned an enzyme that they had in their body that was being used for something else into a catalyst for a light-producing reaction. So the enzyme is kind of a big molecule, and it sits inside the firefly lantern. So if you turn over a firefly and look at it carefully, you'll see a yellow part of its body. That's the light-producing lantern. And inside that lantern are cells that have an enzyme. It's called luciferase, named the Latin for light bearer. And it's kind of a big thing. And it's got a three-dimensional structure with a little pocket. It's like a baseball glove, right? It has a pocket where a much smaller, like ping pong sized molecule fits into the pocket of that glove. And with a couple of other additional chemicals added, that enzyme gets the ping pong ball substrate so excited chemically. Its chemical bonds get very, very excited, start to vibrate, and then eventually it transforms into a lower energy compound, and the chemical energy is given off in a flash of light. And so that luciferase and its substrate is something that's conserved. It's basically the same enzyme across all of the firefly beetles. Very, very almost identical protein structure. Other organisms use enzymes that work in a similar way. Other bioluminescent organisms like bioluminescent jellyfish and things like that, they also have an enzyme that confusingly is also called luciferase, but it's a completely different chemical structure. And so there are many, many different luciferases. Firefly luciferase is just one evolutionary solution to the challenge of producing light.
Incredible. I've heard or read that it's one of the most efficient light forms, something like 99.5% efficient in terms of not giving off much heat, like an incandescent light bulb would. Is that about right?
Well, the number is probably not right, but yeah, it is very, very efficient. It's a very, very efficient way of producing light. It's not very energetically costly for fireflies. We did a study once where we measured the energetic cost of flashing for species of firefly in New England, and the energetic cost of walking and the energetic cost of flying. And it turns out that flying is like super, super expensive. Most of the stored energy, like the larval reserves of a firefly, go into either egg production for females or flying around advertising, I'm a male, I'm a male, I'm a male, for the males. And flashing is not very energetically expensive. It's a very efficient process. It's cool.
And is the science there being used in any sort of human applications and outside of researching fireflies?
Yeah, so I like to say that firefly bioluminescence was invented by fireflies and then honed over millions of years of evolution. And then we came along and we've been able to harness firefly light-producing chemicals for human health applications. It's like a gift that fireflies have given us. In addition to like the wonder, if that weren't enough, they've also given this really practical tool to us. So the chemical reaction that I just described was discovered, the details of it were worked out about 70 years ago by some scientists at Johns Hopkins. And after the discovery of the firefly bioluminescent reaction and the chemical compounds, they started to be used the enzyme was used in a lot of industrial and health applications. So it started to be used in food safety testing. Firefly chemicals were sent by NASA to detect life on Mars in some of the early Viking missions. Since about the 1980s, the gene that encodes the protein firefly luciferase has been sequenced, and we can then produce that gene. And it's been used, the luciferase gene has been used as a reporter for genetic activity in testing anti-cancer drugs. It's been used in developing drought-resistant plant crops. So it's been incredibly, firefly luciferase has turned out to have a whole panoply of really, really important biomedical and scientific applications. It's been really, really useful for people.
So I think that's a great segue into sort of what we can do to protect these animals and what they need from us. I mean, they've given us so much, as you said, both just the wonder and the awe, but also these applications that have made our lives better and possible. What does a firefly need to survive? Maybe specifically the fireflies that we're seeing here in New Canaan.
Yeah, so fireflies need same kinds of things as everything. They need food, they need shelter, they need water, and there I mentioned before that in many parts of the world, including in the U.S., that firefly populations in some places they're really hurting, they're really diminishing. And so, one of the things that fireflies need is a good habitat. Certain firefly species have really specialized habitats that they live in. They will only live in an old field, or they'll only live along a stream, or they'll only live in a wetlands, or they'll only live in a forest. And so they have like very specific habitat requirements. And so preserving habitat is probably the most important thing. If you have a place where there are fireflies, don't just assume that there's always going to be fireflies there. If somebody comes and builds a house in that same place, there's not going to be fireflies there. Fireflies can't, I just described the larval phase of fireflies. They live underground. They're not really going to move very far. So if you disturb a firefly habitat, they can't just pick up and move somewhere else. So preserving habitat is the biggest thing. If fireflies also need protection from light pollution. So we've just described this light-based mating communication that the lightning bug fireflies use. And it turns out that we have very good evidence that if around them, the ambient light levels are too high, then firefly communication is disrupted. They can't talk to each other if it's too bright at night. And so for all the lightning bug fireflies, light pollution is a really, really is a major threat. Pesticides is another really big threat to fireflies. And so many people don't actually stop to think that fireflies are beetles, beetles are insects, insecticides kill insects. And so especially when you consider that fireflies larvae spend 2 years underground, they're going to be exposed to any insecticides that are applied to or leach into the soil. If you wanted to create a firefly-friendly habitat, you would minimize the use of insecticides. You would minimize light pollution, especially during firefly mating season. Turn off your outdoor lights. Use motion detectors. Get rid of your outdoor security lights. Make sure it's dark. You would leave some fireflies need moisture in all of their different eggs, larvae, pupae, adults. They need moisture. Female fireflies love moss. So leave mossy areas, plant shrubs, and plant native plants. If you need to have a lawn, which you really don't need to have, mow the grass higher because longer grass holds more moisture. Leave some habitat that's undisturbed, like leaf litter, rotting wood around the edges. These are great places for firefly larvae and their prey to develop. We're hoping to actually, we have this sort of dream of creating firefly sanctuaries around the U.S., like the one in New Canaan. I don't know if you've heard about Homegrown National Parks. It's an initiative of planting native that was started by Doug Tallamy, and it's kind of a grassroots call to action for replanting, for replacing lawns with native plantings. The goal is to replace half of lawns in the U.S. with plants that support healthy ecosystems. Those same kinds of habitats also would support fireflies. So it would be great if everyone, could identify an area in their town or neighborhood park that has fireflies, and then implement some of these protective measures to protect the firefly populations that are there. These would be sanctuaries that would be not just for fireflies, but for people too. As you see in New Canaan, these are really special places. They're kind of sanctuaries for people, a place where people can go and reconnect with nature, reconnect with the majesty, with the mystery of the natural world. So this is a kind of, if you guys are interested in starting this movement, we'd like to have a firefly sanctuary movement all across the U.S.
Yeah, that's such an important part of this whole sort of larger conservation picture. There's only so much that an organization like a land trust can do. But if we can start to spread that conservation ethic onto people's private properties and transition some lawns into habitat, that's such a huge thing. You mentioned Doug Tallamy. We actually had him in town, and it was right before the start of the pandemic. And yeah, delivered an excellent presentation talking about the important role that we as just private landowners can play in protecting habitat for insects and pollinators and fireflies. So it's great to hear that reiterated here. Thinking out into the future, do you expect there to be any impacts on firefly populations or species due to the impacts of climate change?
Yeah, climate change, everything will change. So one of the things that we are already seeing is that areas that are being hit with increased drought. I mentioned that fireflies need moisture to survive in all their different life stages. So firefly populations in those areas we expect to decline. So the southeastern United States has had several years of pretty severe drought. There are actually fireflies in the American West, in the Southwest. People don't talk about them very much, but they're restricted to areas where there is permanent moisture. Those sources of permanent moisture dry up, and with climate change, those fireflies will be gone. And some of them have a very narrow geographic range and very specialized habitat. So that's one major thing. In terms of it, we also expect firefly species that are restricted geographically to like more southern states are going to be moving up into northern states and Canada, shifting their range as other species shift too.
Okay. And I guess the last wrap-up question is, as folks are visiting our Firefly Sanctuary here in New Canaan, what are some of the things that they can keep in mind to ensure that this place remains a really high quality habitat and that our fireflies are protected? We talked a little bit about light pollution and things like that. So just some basic things that our visitors, especially those listening right now, can take maybe on their way out of the sanctuary to ensure that the fireflies stay here for years and decades and centuries to come.
So let's see. Let's see. So there's a lot of things that, so one thing that's really, really great about your Firefly Sanctuary and many other places in the country where people can go to see fireflies is it's quite a life-changing experience for many people. And so firefly tourism everywhere is kind of on the rise. And as more and more people go to these places where fireflies are congregating to mate and reproduce the next firefly generation, we have to be very cautious about, we want people to experience this. It's incredible. It's a gateway to the miraculous, but we also want to protect the firefly populations. So when you're at a firefly site or a place where a lot of fireflies are, try to just, stay on the designated path. There's going to be female fireflies, and firefly juvenile stages are all going to be on the ground. So you don't want to walk around in the firefly habitat. And it also is a really good idea to just go out to a place where you can see the fireflies and then just stand there and drink it in. You don't need to walk around a lot. You don't need to catch the fireflies. Just pay attention to what they're doing and watch their natural behavior. If you have any kind of insect repellent that none of us want to be bitten by mosquitoes, put on your insect repellent, at the car, not in the firefly habitat. We know that insect repellent interferes with insect smell receptors. Some fireflies actually use smell as part of their mating rituals. So there's some simple things that people can do. Also, really try to, when you get to a good spot to watch the fireflies, don't use any lights. Don't use your cell phone to take pictures. The screen is really bright. Don't use a flashlight to, make sure you're safe. Just once you're at the spot where you're looking at the fireflies, really, really reduce, just keep it dark. Fireflies will love you for it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. If you have any other sort of parting thoughts or words as we wrap up here, I'm sure our listeners would love to hear, but this has been a great conversation. I've learned so much, and I'm sure our visitors will too, about the fireflies that are at our sanctuary around the world more broadly, and the steps that we can take to protect them and ensure that the next generation gets to witness this splendor as well. So thank you so much, Dr. Lewis.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks for helping to keep the firefly magic alive.